Hi everyone, happy World Oceans Day. And we are now broadcasting live again from St. John's, Newfoundland. But the guests today are based in Australia and the Pacific Islands. So this session in particular is aimed to talk about small-scale fisheries and ocean sustainability in Oceania. So I am today with me, I have 5 guests who have been kind enough to accept the invitation to join us. So since last week, we have a webinar once a day, and now we're going to do a 24-hour program just to bring the perspective, the conversation about small-scale fisheries to as many parts of the world as possible. So welcome everyone to the broadcast, and we would like to say hello to our audience in Australia and in the Pacific Island. So with me today, I would introduce my first guest. That would be Kate Barclay. So hello, Kate. Kate is a professor of global studies at the University of Technology, Sydney. She's been conducting research to explore the human dimensions of fisheries, aquaculture, and marine conservation, looking at social and economic contributions of seafood industries to communities in Australia, Indonesia, and Solomon Islands. So Kate is also analyzing tuna and sea cucumber fisheries, and is a key contributor to the Pacific Handbook for Gender Equity and Social Inclusion for Coastal Fisheries and Aquaculture. So welcome, Kate, to the broadcast.
Thank you, Ratan.
So the second speaker is Andrew Song. So Andrews is a lecturer and Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Research Fellow at the University of Technology, Sydney. So he's been conducting research on governance and geography of coastal and inland fisheries and has worked in many places, including Malawi, South Korea, Canada, and the Pacific Islands. So Andrew's most recent work is focusing on the transboundary and multi-scale governance of small-scale fisheries as it relates to the issues of illegal fishing and maritime security. Welcome, Andrew, to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Rat.
Okay, so the third speaker is Seno Mali. So Seno is a Solomon Islander pursuing a PhD in law at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong. In the past decade, he has worked on community-based resource management efforts and fisheries management at 3 levels of governance: community, provincial, and national. For PhD, Seno will use a mixed method approach to analyze the development of national policies and strategies and actors and networks involved in community-based fisheries management and rural development work in Solomon Islands. So welcome, Seno.
Thank you.
Next speaker, panelist is Sangeeta Mangubai. Sangeeta is the director of the Wildlife Conservation Society's program in Fiji. She works on policies, governance, and management of small-scale fisheries and doing applied research to look at locally managed marine areas, fisheries value chains, and fisheries, and impacts of COVID-19 on small-scale fisheries. Sangeeta is an editor for the Pacific Community's Women in Fisheries Information Bulletin and was awarded a 2018 Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation to work on mainstreaming gender and human rights-based approaches into coastal fisheries management in Melanesia. So welcome, Sangeeta.
Okay, pura vinaka everybody from Fiji.
Nice. Okay, so now we have another speaker, a panelist, the final panelist, Mario Klein-Lankost. Mariel is a PhD student at Faculty of Arts and Social Science, University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. She studies small-scale fishers who are engaging in direct and short-chain seafood sales in Australia, Western Europe, and Northern America. She's been doing research in 3 continents. Her research aligns with the degrowth movement as well as the slow food movement. Through in-depth interviews, she would examine how fishers and people around them create community economies and to what extent those help them sustain their fishing livelihoods. Before commencing her research, she traveled Europe for a year to interview small-scale fishers, wondering how they were doing. She combined quotes with photographs and published them under her project called More to See. And we actually are doing a little bit of preview of that project as part of the Small Scale Fisheries Arts Festival, which will be aired right after this program, the first section. Okay, so thank you for that. Now, this is this is a little bit different from what we were doing last week, right? So last week we had a webinar, we had a lot of information we wanted to disseminate to everyone, and we have a really audience who are just learning a lot about small scale fisheries and are trying to find out more. Basically, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of topics that we discussed, and for now, for this kind of setting, we thought that for today, we might want to keep the conversation a little bit casual. We're going to be just basically having panel discussion. And the topic for today, as we mentioned, it's going to be related to the issues and the challenges that small-scale fisheries in Oceania are facing. And of course, we have to acknowledge that some of those challenges have existed even before we are into this COVID-19. But the COVID-19, as we learned from last week too, that around the world, it kind of enhanced, make the situation a lot more challenging. So I think some of you are looking into that. So it'd be great to hear how things are right now, based on what you have been looking at, whether from whatever perspective that you're bringing to the situation, and then we can talk a little bit about how COVID-19 is making things more challenging for us. But the general idea would be to really, engage with the participants here. We would be able to bring some of the comments or questions from the participant, put that onto the screen, and then we'll have some conversation. If you feel like you wanted to introduce yourself, for instance, I'm just gonna show how it's gonna work, right? For instance, we could say hello to Connie because Connie is saying hi from the SPC, right? So a lot, because we really can keep this lively in introducing people who are watching us, and then make sure that we although we are not able to hear you, but be able to to say hello to you in this way. For instance, we would like to also say hello to Federico, maybe next door to Andrew and somewhere. Now we want to introduce you to Kate. Some many of you know Kate already. Kate has been really active in social media and really keeping us, people know a lot about what's going on with Kate help here. So it's been really good that way. Let me see here. We have somebody from the Caledonians, right? So this really can work, even though you might not be able to say much, but you can use exactly what you've been doing. You can use these chat box to put comment, post questions to the panelists, and then we're trying to get as many questions as possible. And I wanted to. This is my help. Ruyel is a master student from Bangladesh, so he's sitting with me somewhere here in St. John's, and we're trying to also help with taking notes and figuring out what's how things are going with the panel. I'm going to start from inviting each of the speakers to make a first round of remarks. And then we'll go into some of these questions about, the situation, the COVID, what we're going to do, what we're doing about it, who's doing what, and then what are the issues that we really need to keep in mind. Eventually, we would want to get into, what are we going to do to keep thinking, to keep the small-scale fisheries in the forefront of the conversation about ocean sustainability. What would be some of the important things to consider in a post-COVID world in particular? So we'll take some of the questions as we do this round, and then towards the end, we have about an hour and a half to do this, and towards the end, I would again invite each of you to make the final remarks. Okay? So let's start from you, Kate. Tell us a little bit about your research, what you've been doing, what kind of issues and challenges in small-scale fisheries that you are trying to address. Please, Kate.
Okay. Today, I'd like to talk about some work that I've been doing in Southeast Australia. And look at small-scale fisheries in Southeastern Australia. Over the last 5 years or so, we've had a couple of projects in particularly New South Wales and Victoria. A little bit of what I'm talking about relates to Queensland as well, but mainly New South Wales and Victoria. We've been looking at the social and economic contributions fisheries make to the communities in which they're based in coastal areas and inland in Victoria as well, a little bit. And in both of those states, most fisheries are small scale. They're 1, 2, 3 people working together, mainly in multi-species and multi-gear fisheries. They work in estuary and coastal areas, mainly with day trips, and they're mostly family businesses. We do also have some smallish and medium-sized trawlers, and on the east coast some longliners that work on tuna, but even those, they usually have a maximum of up to 5 crew. So in this part of Australia, almost all fisheries are small scale. And in Australian in the past, there was overfishing in the 20th century, but from the 1990s, the shift towards sustainable design in Australian fisheries management, or development rather than decline, meant that most of the overfishing has more or less been addressed. There are some issues, obviously, that could always be improved, but on the whole, fisheries management is pretty good at preventing overfishing. It's not a serious problem for Australia's fisheries. They have some more problems in competition with other resource users, particularly recreational fishers, and tend to see themselves as being in competition with professional fishers and have them excluded from the area. So we have in New South Wales recreational fishing havens.
There's a question to understand the echo.
And then, these are, and also in New South Wales and Victoria, there's a lot of high demand for coastal areas from other resource users, say high-end property owners. So these are the kinds of pressures that fishers face rather than overfishing as such. Australia is a relatively high production cost location, especially labour, but some other things to do with running fishing vessels mean that the fish that come from Australian fisheries are fairly high cost, and those factors and other factors mean that we actually eat well over half, perhaps around 70% of the seafood we eat in Australia is imported. We have some of the fisheries are very oriented toward export markets, particularly in Asia. So if we have abalone dive fisheries and lobster fisheries and some crab that export to China and other Northeast Asian countries. And then within the domestic markets, we have much is oriented towards food service and restaurant chains, partly also to do with the prices, it being local production being higher cost often than imported seafood. And then there's a whole range of historical and logistical reasons that mean that it's not been that easy in many Australian coastal locations to buy seafood from that area. The seafood, if it's caught there, tends to go to metropolitan markets or is exported, and or goes to certain kinds of restaurant chains, and that's been a problem that people have identified, especially in terms of meeting unmet demand from tourists, both domestic tourists and international tourists, who, when they come to coastal areas, want to eat locally produced seafood and they can't find it very easily. So this is something that people already knew, but the research we've done has helped systematically look at it and understand in terms of how important it is to tourists to try that they want to eat local food, and what proportion of local tourists want to eat local food, as well as what the tourism industry and the hospitality industry sees as important in that area. So that's basically an introduction of what I see as this current situation that we've been facing in the last few months with southeastern Australian small-scale fisheries.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, it's always interesting, right, to note that Australia seems to be really quite doing well when it comes to management of fisheries. But again, just like other places, there are a lot of other pressure or new demands, or these kind of access and even supply to various sectors and etc. So it'd be good to hear a little bit more about that in a little while. So I now like to invite Andrew, please, to open to start with your opening remarks.
Thank you. So yeah, just briefly, I'll speak about the blue justice aspect of the global efforts to combat IUU fishing. As many of us know, IUU fishing refers to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So why do we need to talk about this blue justice aspect of IUU fishing? And why do we need to make this an issue? It's because the way IUU fishing is being fought on the global scale has the potential to unfairly marginalize small-scale fisheries. Currently, stopping IUU fishing has become all about monitoring, surveillance, deterrence, and sanction. And also it is increasingly relying on data and communication technologies. But in the process of being cemented as a popular and entrenched narrative, which centers on these things, the policies on IUU fishing tend to overlook unintended negative consequences. So what are the unintended consequences that can affect small-scale fisheries? The current action on fighting IUU fishing can disadvantage small-scale fisheries in at least two ways. First, the origin of IUU fishing, including its terminology, comes from concerns about high seas fishing by industrial fleets. Specifically, it was the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, CLAMAR, as they were concerned with the longline fishery for toothfish in the Antarctic Ocean. So the idea of illegal, unregulated, and unreported in that context doesn't really fit with the typical small-scale fisheries context that we know, which is predominantly coastal, happening in the coastal and nearshore areas. It has a lot of informal and customary elements. And also in many places, small-scale fisheries are de facto unregulated, meaning open access. Even in some places, it's de jure open access, places like Kiribati. So the line between legal and illegal is rather blurry. Instead of a clear binary, what we see is more of a spectrum of illegality, especially when seen from the perspective of the fishing communities. So unfortunately, the popular concept of IUU, as we usually take it from the FAO International Plan of Action, published in 2001, it simply makes many small-scale fisheries an IUU fishing. Discursively, this can lead to small-scale fishers being regarded as the bad guy, a nuisance that complicates the IUU picture because of their diversity and complexity, or in a more extreme sense, small-scale fisheries are seen as something to be gotten rid of because they are difficult to control and govern. Practically, the trends we see towards data analytics and data transparency, and more specifically, the EU policy that requests full value chain documentation, all these things increases reporting burden for all fishing businesses, both small and large scale, but it disproportionately affects small-scale fisheries, especially those based in developing countries, because many small-scale fishing operators face difficulties in complying with such precise data-driven approach. So this can amount to the structural marginalization of small-scale fisheries in the export market. The concern that small-scale fisheries are falling behind in the MSC certification, as many people have noted over the years, is a telling example of this. Of course, IUU fishing is a serious problem, and small-scale fisheries also engage in various destructive fishing methods, which need to be effectively controlled. But I'm afraid that the one-size-fits-all approach to understanding and stopping IUU fishing, and therefore not meaningfully differentiating small-scale fisheries, will not lead to fair and legitimate outcomes. Two examples we just spoke are that the current action unfairly labels small-scale fisheries as IUU fishing, and also possibly takes them out of the export market. So how can we address this? I can briefly speak about two broad strategies. One is to make exception for small-scale fisheries in the various measures designed to combat IUU fishing. So here we're talking about specific provisions that are suited to the characteristics of small-scale fisheries, and they might involve more lenient rules or exempting small-scale fisheries altogether. Secondly, there could be differentiated IUU targets for different countries. For example, depending on the proportion and importance of small-scale fisheries in each country. So all in all, fighting IUU fishing needs to be done in a just and sensitive manner that recognizes the differences of small-scale fisheries and the important contributions they make to local and national economies. This consideration has been mainly lacking in the current IUU discourse and action. So that's a perspective I wanted to share. In terms of empirical research work for the region, I have just started a project that examines transboundary small-scale fisheries. These are small-scale fisheries that cross international boundaries. And this kind of a long-distance movement are typically unsanctioned and therefore a type of IUU. What's interesting here is because this kind of fishing involves border infractions, they're not just a matter of illegal fishing per se, but it is also construed as a national security threat, where the Navy could get involved, and there could be diplomatic disputes around these incidents. So I'll be looking at one example in the Asia Pacific, and I will focus on the Vietnamese boats coming to the remote islands of Pacific Island countries to poach sea cucumber and giant clam. And I'll conduct field work once international travel resumes, and then I'll be happy to report any findings in the next year or so. So I'll finish there.
Thank you. That's going to be quite an really interesting work to see. But I'm glad you brought up this IUU and how that is being how small-scale fisheries, if you were to apply these kind of the way they think about IUU to small-scale fisheries, almost by default, most of the small-scale fisheries may be falling into that category. So again, we're seeing policies that are being designed or with intention, the different intention being applied to small-scale fisheries without much consideration. So I think we need to, from the governance perspective, which many of you are interested in, that's something that we're going to have to really discuss further. So thank you for that. Seno, tell us a little bit more, please, about your research and the situation that you're dealing, the small-scale fisheries where you are dealing with. Thank you. You want to turn on your microphone? Sorry, Seno, you just unmute your mic.
Thank you again for the opportunity. And yeah, to talk to you all in the panel and others listening across the globe. Yeah, for my intent for the panel, I will be speaking on the topic which was in the email sent, which is, can you speculate on the future of small-scale fisheries in my country, Solomon Islands, post COVID-19? Well, I'll start off with my research. I am second year into my PhD at Wollongong. And yes, COVID has really taken a lot of turns to the drafting of my questions, which I'm in that stage of submitting for ethics. And I started with this topic of, which I've worked, as you said in my introduction, I've worked in very much the NGO sector for the past decade, in that I've worked with community-based fisheries management, which is very much the space in which small-scale fishery is in Solomon Islands. And working at that level of management, there in the set of the country, obviously there are many loopholes, if I may say, many gaps in the institutional arrangement itself. There is levels of complexity in just a community-based way of managing resources, where you have customary marine tenure, which is very much similar to other Pacific Islands, and the way in which people harvest, process, and trade. So there's all the complexity in Solomon Islands, as in many Pacific Islands. But for the intent of my research, which is very much the PhD I'm pursuing, I'm looking at seeking impact and sustainability through fisheries management, aligning that with rural development. And I see in that these two programs have been in the country for a while. We're 40 years by independence, and both these programs have been in the country. However, the question of its sustainability has taken me to the interest of this study, in that programs are set up, projects come and go. However, at the community level, they aren't really meeting the needs of communities. In that, for my particular PhD, I will be looking at 5 themes. Theme 1 is policy analysis. I will analyze policy and strategies, fisheries management and rural development prior as early as independence 1978 till present date. I will also be looking at actors and networks, looking at the different programs, donors, the different activities that have happened between these two spaces. And thirdly, looking very much at the community level, looking at the implementation of these strategies, in that it is evident or obvious in previous projects that these has been top-down approaches to community settings. And they look on social. I didn't want to touch and focus too much on gender. It might take me down another road, but look at social participation and inclusion, looking at the different social groups in any community setting that is part of coastal management. And that takes me to the attention of small-scale fisheries. In the context of Solomon Islands, where small-scale fisheries very much happens within a community-based space, a community-based framework, in that communities that live on the coast rely on these fisheries very much as a source of protein or as small-scale livelihood. So we, in our present state, we don't have very much big in large scales or medium scales in which you have boats which do small scale fisheries and trade and export. However, there are two invertebrates which are very much part of these fisheries, and that is sea cucumber and trochus. And with COVID-19 being in the recent months, and for us, since we're yet in the list of not being one of the affected countries, I've taken that too much attention to, in that policies have been discussed and there have been changes in policy development at the government level and further down, which can affect the provincial level and community level, in that the Solomon government in the recent month, having had a mock lockdown for 36 hours, which was very interesting in some sense, but having that experience, there is a lot of change in the activities that are happening at the moment. And there are only certain government sectors which are open and are operating. And one of it is fisheries. And I think the very attention to being, we're quite active in the offshore, and that is tuna and having the foreign fisheries also based in Honiara. So with that, fisheries has been the only and one of the few sectors that have opened and operating during the situation of COVID. So with that, I'm very interested to share with you all what I see as the fisheries, small-scale fisheries being affected at the community-based, however, with very much looking at governance and all policy that is decided on at the national level, however affects the provincial and community sector. With that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Senu. It's your sound is a little bit broken, but we can get basically, I think, the main point of what you are talking about. And I think for a small island development state like SIDS that you are in, you know, this conversation about sustainability and the SDGs and all the rest is really quite central. You know, SDG 14 always speak, you know, first there is particular target to really address sustainability issues in SIDS, and now with the COVID-19. So I would love to hear more about the kind of policies that you were referring to. Later on, we can hear a little bit more about how is it that, you know, the governments at various levels, how they are dealing with, right? How community is dealing with it, and perhaps you know, at different levels of governance as well. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. Sangeeta, let's go to you and hear what your experience is and the kind of issues and situation that you're facing, please.
Well, thank you and welcome everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and its impact to small-scale fisheries. So I thought I'd just start with a bit of the global context and then give you some new information, some new studies that we've been doing in Fiji. So, you know, if you think about the global COVID-19 crisis has really forced us to recognize the failures of our existing social and economic systems. And while, you know, that initial focus has been on the health crisis, governments all over the world are actually starting to widen their scope and to look at the knock-on economic effects from market disruptions. And the pandemic has had an unprecedented impact on small-scale fisheries and coastal communities across the world. We know this because a recent scientific global perspective led by Nathan Bennett and Elena Finkbeiner highlighted that there have been a number of impacts that we've seen. We have seen in some places fisheries have completely shut down, others where there's been increased risks for fishers and processors, increased marginalization of groups, exacerbated vulnerabilities to other social and economic stresses, and obviously, as Andrew touched on, increased illegal IUU fishing. So, well, how are small-scale fisheries in the Pacific faring in terms of with COVID-19 and what's being done? So the Pacific has actually fared a lot better than other regions. Only 6 of the 22 countries and territories in the Pacific have had cases of COVID-19, with Fiji as recently as this weekend now declared COVID-free. However, the shutdown or the reduction of markets is still reverberating throughout the countries as our borders remain closed. And at the same time, much of our understanding around the impact of COVID-19 is really anecdotal because of the restriction we have on movement is really limiting, you know, data collection. So I wanted to share a little bit about some work that is going on. So in May, the locally managed Marine Area Network, in partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Society, World Fish, and ANCORS, developed a rapid survey that could be administered over the telephone to quantify and qualify the impact of COVID-19 on coastal Indigenous communities across the Pacific. So to ensure that any impact evaluation was inclusive, WCS also conducted interviews with other ethnic groups, specifically Indo-Fijians, with significant investments in the small-scale fisheries sector. So let me just very briefly share some of the results of these 2 studies. So firstly, we found that while there has been some migration of indigenous Fijians from urban to rural areas, particularly as people have lost jobs, the impact felt by the communities that we interviewed was actually much less than expected. Many explained that they returned to the village, they started working on their land and were fishing to sustain themselves. And this really highlighted the strength of communal village systems and that extended family support networks that are in place that people can tap into in these times of crisis. And the greatest impact that many highlighted was actually not from COVID-19, but actually from Category 4 Cyclone Harold that hit Fiji in April this year, causing damage to agriculture in particular in the villages that we interviewed. So while the survey didn't really detect, it didn't detect any kind of differences in impact faced by Indigenous Fijian women versus men, we did see that women dominating in the marketplaces, like in the capital Suva, once lockdowns were lifted. And I just want to add a caveat to this is that the study didn't get to, again, because we're in this phase of having to do these rapid assessments, we didn't really get to ask more deeper questions around, how does COVID-19 increase women's time burdens, resulting from, increased workload, from childcare, or increases in domestic violence, which we know has been recorded in places like Fiji. Now, just by contrast, the COVID-19 has had a very different impact on other ethnic groups, such as Indo-Fijian fishers and traders in Fiji. Specifically, Indo-Fijian fishers and traders explain that the crash in tourism that we're facing has meant that they no longer can sell to resorts and hotels, and now are solely relying on local customers. However, there are fewer local customers due to the growing rates of unemployment and people being more conservative with their spending. Lockdowns impacted a quarter of those interviewed who literally had no income during those lockdown periods. And fishers and traders are also being impacted by a drop in prices for seafood. So on average, the prices and therefore the profits have declined by something like 36.5%, but were as high as 77.8% for some products in some places. The cyclone also caused damage to boats and engines, and many could not continue to go out fishing to earn income for their family or pay back loans that they have on their boats and engines. And so what I wanted to be able to really kind of, showcase and really highlight is what you have in Fiji and in many countries is this crisis within a crisis that is creating a growing food insecurity and poverty in, for example, Indo-Fijian fishers and traders, particularly those without an alternative source of income. And as one female seafood trader explained, I'm just going to share in her words, what she said was, "We only buy small amounts of food at a time because we have to look at our pocket. Sometimes I go out to my relative's house to eat, and sometimes I just eat crackers and tea." So what does the path ahead look like? Well, we know from experience from other natural disasters and economic disruptions that often these impacts that we see, they really extend for over 1 or 2 years. And this is probably a realistic timeline that we're also going to be having to think about. We know we're going to probably see, and we already are seeing, an increased pressure on natural resources as countries look for opportunities for economic growth. And in places like in Fiji and other parts of the Pacific, this often can mean increased exploitation of economic resources. And depending on how that is managed and rolled out, I think we really are going to see, unless we do this correctly, a widening of inequalities around who gets access to resources as we look at these recovery plans and processes. So I think I might just leave it as there, and I know that we'll have a chance as we come back, I'll start to talk a little bit more about some potential solutions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sankita, for that. It is really, we have been hearing the story, but it's really something that we need to keep in mind. And as you were saying, that the situation before the COVID was not great, and now things are a lot worse. And these kind of increasing vulnerability to some of these, the marginalized or the most vulnerable group is really quite something. I wanted to be able for us to spend a little bit more time thinking about what we can think of, right, collectively as well, in terms of what we might need to start thinking about in the short term and in the kind of medium term and the long term as we are plowing ahead. But let's go to our final speaker for this first round. I would like to invite Mario to just give a little bit of background about your research and just the kind of issues and challenges in small-scale fisheries that you're trying to address, please.
Perfect, thank you. I'm trying to share my screen and show you a photo. Yes. So I've written a piece and I want to read it out loud. I hope that's okay. It's a bit different, but I'll go. So thank you for having me as part of this event and for inviting me, Ratana. I'm a PhD student here in Sydney. I started last year and I decided to go to Sydney because I felt good with Kate, who's here, and Mike Fabenye, who's my second supervisor. My intuition was correct and I feel very grateful for the freedom that I get and the trust that I feel. My research focuses specifically on small-scale fishers who engage in direct sales, meaning selling their catch without an intermediary, or fishers who engage in short-chain markets with, for instance, one fishmonger between them and the consumer. The Too Big to Ignore webinar of last Monday discussed how fishers respond to COVID-19, and a tremendous amount of small-scale fishers are now engaging in direct sales. Food relocalization might be an effect of COVID-19, and though fishers are struggling globally as their markets have collapsed, I think this shift is exciting. The fishers who I work with come from Australia, Western Europe, the US, and Canada. Most of them I've met when I was traveling Europe, and I was wondering how small-scale fishers are doing. I also met a big and diverse group of people at Slow Fish, which is a part of the slow food movement. This movement fights for good, clean, and fair food and aims to maintain local food traditions. Fishers are fighting. They're fighting for their right to exist. Existence as a fisherman or as a fisherwoman. With this, I mean that people want to be fishers, they love to be fishers, and they don't want to diversify out of fishing. The photo that you can see here was taken in a shed of a fisher whom I met in Ireland, Mickey. The plate says, "If they don't have fishing in heaven, I'm not going." Mickey is a salmon fisher and comes from a family that has been fishing for generations. Mickey said that he's never been contracted for a permanent job there's no way to keep him on during fishing season. Those 8 weeks per year are the weeks he can be a practicing fisherman. In his words, it's not about money. Fishing is beautiful. What I want to bring into research is people's self-determinacy, their autonomy, their power, and their love. We often know what fishers don't have access to or what they are in need of. I try to look at what people do with what they have. How do fishers and their communities sustain fishing livelihoods, even if all the odds are against them? I look at market strategies that people engage in. I wonder how people got there, where it's led them, and how they're doing. There can be a range of markets people engage in. Often they engage in multiple strategies at the same time to see what works or what doesn't. As strategies, think about direct sales from the boat to the consumer, direct sales to restaurants, having a stall at a farmer's market, maybe a cooperative that sets seafood prices collaboratively and sells collectively. Some fishers are taking tourists aboard, giving fishing workshops, or they teach people how to process, cook, or smoke fish. Some people have opened restaurants, or they develop local food labels. Here in Australia, I met Tom and Glenn from Fairfish Adelaide. They created a market where fishers directly sell to chefs. Not only has this helped fishers financially, also politically, this has been an important market shift. When the government attempted to close a net fishery, the chefs spoke out and made sure the ban was not enforced. Fairfish has won a prize for most innovative enterprise, in which actually they simplified the market chain and relocalized seafood consumption. Due to COVID-19, Fairfish has had to change tactics and is now, as others, directly selling to local consumers instead of to restaurants. Some fishers are using technology to inform consumers about the catches that will be landed in the port soon. In this way, fish can be sold even before it leaves the boat. Others have web shops and sell their fish to consumers in other regions or other countries. I believe that direct sales do not per se have to include consumers who live where the fish is caught. It seems to me that by developing these market strategies, people are united in communities that go beyond fishing towns. Fishers, both men and women, and others who are part of self-built markets, are passionately fighting for fishing livelihoods. They have come this far and aim to continue for much longer. The weather changes daily, and so do the natural, political, and economical environments. We have to acknowledge fishers' persistence, their inventiveness, their strength, passions, hopes, and beliefs. The world seems to be falling apart, but with all loose pieces, we can reorganize societies. I'm optimistic. I dare to look at the positives, and I want to fight hard for fishing sustenance and see a blooming future for small-scale fisheries. Let's dare to think of love and beauty. How precious is it to be in love with your job, to fantasize each time you go out about what you'll find in your nets, to carry knowledge from generation to generation, and to be deeply embedded in nature. We have been talking about human rights to resources, to food, to labor, and to markets. Who knows, maybe one day we'll have a human right to pleasure and fulfillment. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Maria. Okay, so we definitely have a pretty good range of perspectives here, right? In terms of not just the research focus alone, but I think you're also coming from quite different different areas when you're trying to look at small-scale fisheries, different lenses even, right? Which I think is great. But there's something in common, which is kind of the interest around small-scale fisheries well-being and the sustainability, and then the governance. So I think those are something that we really can have more conversation about. So again, small-scale fisheries have been facing a lot of challenges even before the COVID-19, and they come in various forms. With COVID-19, there are a lot more. There seems to be in some cases. There might be also some opportunities that are happening for small-scale fisheries in some cases as well. So I also, wanted to have some chat about conversation about that also. So we already have now a couple of questions, and we could do that first, just so that the audience can feel that we really are serious about engaging with you, because we actually have one question coming from the same person, but one question to Seno and one question to Sangeeta. Maybe we take care of that first, and then we can have an open round, more open round. So Seno, you wanted to. This is from Federico, and so talking about this, and which is related to the kind of topic that we wanted to discuss anyway, right? What is his situation here with in the Solomon Island? You want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you again, Ratana. Thank you for the opportunity. And I can see the question on the screen. Thank you, Federico. And his question reads, would like to hear more about how Solomon Islands left the open during COVID, whether this means more fishing or pressure fisheries. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, the thought behind that sector being opened during the COVID situation would be possibly being we're very much involved in the offshore fisheries, in which we're one of the other member countries which have a lot of operation happening in the offshore, which we have tuna fishing, and that brings tuna back to our cannery, which is Salt Tuna, also based in the Solomon Islands. So with that in the offshore, I gather the sector has been open, being the government institution, which is mandated, which is the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources, see this as a revenue for the country, in that tuna fishing continued during the situations of COVID-19. However, with that, yes, the pressure on fishing itself is still that ongoing threat in that sector. Having FFA here in Honiara, there is that ongoing efforts of monitoring fishing, of ensuring that IUU activities aren't happening in the offshore. And with the restrictions that have come about during the COVID-19 situation, of which Solomon Netherlands had a state of emergency, which is still ongoing till the end of June 2020. It's the end of this month, of which the Prime Minister will see whether that ban of the state of emergency get lifted. However, there have been rumors that monitoring the borders, there are little boats that have snugged in to fish, which has been rumors in the media, and that could possibly be longliners or pole line vessels that have come in. And interestingly, that sector is open, and with that quarantine and monitoring efforts that have happened on the border have mostly been focused of people moving in, but not very much attention on the fisheries activities that have happened in the periphery. So yes, that would still have a pressure on fishing, and also the pressure on the fisheries itself in terms of offshore fishing. However, with communities on the coastal area, I can agree to results which Sangeeta shared during the studies that have happened recently, in that with the government restructuring itself, a lot of people have moved back to the communities, and in that numbers at the community level have gone up, and people have turned to backyard gardens as a source of food and also as a source of income. And even at the market today, at the central market in Honiara, I can see, as compared to the past years, in that produce has been pretty high, and people have come into the city to sell their produce. And in seeing that there is no obvious of the sales declining, though there is a lot more coming in. But the pressure on which I see as foreseen in this situation is people would be fishing well below the size limit. There will be a lot more people engaged in that they spend a lot more time in harvesting to sell on the fishing sector. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, the connection it's not the best at the moment. So, but we're going to keep going for a little bit. At least we can see you. If it gets so bad and you feel like you need to turn off your camera, that would be fine as well. But, leave it on for now. So, there are two things that could be happening, right, with the situation. One is effects on the fishery resources. And I'm actually quite curious now, given, Kate, what you're saying about how Australia is also doing always very well with fisheries management. Is there anyone trying to now making any kind of monitoring of what this situation could have added pressure on the resources, affecting the fishery sustainability, or things are actually, we have heard in some places, right, that because people don't go fishing, then things seem to be better when it comes to the resource status. You have any, or maybe Andrew too, you have any kind of information on that at all?
Just to speak on the Australian side, there doesn't seem to be any more fishing going on, and I haven't heard industry people or government people say they're concerned that there will be an overfishing problem in Australia. It's more of a problem of collapsed markets, and there's probably less fishing going on in Australia.
But that's a kind of things that some people are saying, right? That maybe this COVID-19 is making the kind of resource coming back, so to speak. But in the case of Australia, you were doing quite well. You didn't have that. You don't have this overfishing problem. But maybe in other places, I'm not sure. But then, of course, Andrew, the conversation about the transboundary business, right? I mean, I'm just curious about whether the fishing activities at this time, whether we have started to see the change in both, the kind of like industrial fishing and also in small scale fishing. Before we talk about the effects on fishing communities, I just wanted to just get a sense of whether do we know yet at this time whether we have been seeing a lot less fishing pressure at the moment or more fishing pressure in some ways. And do you have any information about that?
No, I don't have any information that can directly to speak to that. But there have been not sure if we can call it reports, or I guess there are reports coming from Indonesia and other places saying that because this COVID situation is putting a lot of strain on the government functioning, and their budgets are slashed, and a lot of government activities are in budget deficit, meaning that something needs to be cut, and that potentially could be the Coastal Guard functioning and monitoring that goes into controlling illegal fishing. So it's possible that those type of activities are affected by the budget crunch, and so in the Indonesian perspective, they were concerned about that. Apparently, the Fisheries Ministry in Indonesia has its budget for this year slashed by more than a quarter, but they have pledged to keep ramping up their MCS efforts. So I think it's hard to say whether it will have an outcome of decreasing fishing pressure or increasing fishing pressure. I think it will always be a very precarious dynamic, right, between fishers and the government, and if you want to look at it that way. But I think the COVID situation has definitely thrown a curveball into trying to understand that dynamic.
Yeah, no, that I really agree with you. And to bring up this conversation about when there is a constraint in a budget deficit and situation, it might, I like to think that because they have to start prioritizing how they're going to spend money and stuff, if they're not putting so much into, they may stop looking at IUU, small scale fisheries as IUU for a little bit, which might be give you an opportunity, at least, Andrew, to get the government to think about, if like you said, we are concerned about destructive fishing gears, but small scale fisheries have different nature, different way of operation, and serve different purpose and different function. And they are organized in a very different way. And, we heard a lot about this community-based fisheries management and a different governance system. So then rather than trying to, put money into the monitor, control, and surveillance on small-scale fisheries, they might wanted to start reform somehow. I mean, Indonesia, the example you put, they always look at, they always wanted to do more participatory management. But I think we really should push all governments, right, to think even more about what would that governance reform would look like given this situation. So maybe we will ask Sankita to speak a little bit on that in terms of the kind of experience that you have now.
Yeah. So I think it's very challenging because right now everyone's sort of still in this kind of crisis stress mode, and you have this situation, like I think I touched on, is where we don't have good data and information to be making decisions. And so I guess a lot of my concern is that there'll be that knee-jerk reaction. Let's stop the funding here. Let's put it here. Let's encourage more fishing, and it's not, it needs to be carefully thought through. So for example, for us in Fiji, some parts of Fiji, they're saying, actually, we're doing less fishing, and people are following the rules that the communities have set up, which is really great. So maybe actually this time might cause some of these communities' fisheries might actually flourish, get a chance to really come back from this lesser fishing pressure. But then you've got other places in which like in the West, where a lot of tourism has been, and where we've seen a lot of newspaper articles where fishers are saying, actually, there's all these new people coming into the fishery. That's going to affect us, as a fisher who's had a long-term investment in that livelihood. And so this comes again to governments as they think about what are the interventions, needing to make sure that's made on, thinking through, I guess, the consequences of the decisions. And I think the governments need to be thinking of two things. There are some really short-term responses that are needed that need to be swift and targeted to those that are most vulnerable. but at the same time creating solutions that are more coordinated. How can we transform existing institutions? How can we do better in terms of thinking about supply chains? How do we make them more sustainable? And how do we create food systems in our own countries that actually help improve the conditions and the resilience of the small-scale fisheries sector and doesn't degrade it during this time of stress? So I think these are really important things to think about. I guess because my concern is. Sorry. I was just going to say, because some of these recovery packages we need to think about is that making sure they really go to the people who are really suffering and really in need, because what we don't want is that our efforts put additional burdens and risk on those already invested in the sector. And we don't want to have a situation where all we're doing is widening inequalities, increasing food insecurity, and increasing poverty. So these are really complex issues that need to be thought through carefully as we have these short-term and these long-term responses.
That's great, thank you. So I think we are all kind of recognizing, right, that this is a very challenging time, and we would want a little bit more time. We will always want a little bit more opportunities, right, to be able to do better. But it's really difficult if somebody needs to make a decision today about what we need to do, and then they want the answer to that now. So what are we going to say to them? So I'm actually quite interested in this one question, because this is another potential actor that could be part of this whole solution-oriented process, right? What can the public do to support the small-scale fisheries, right? With this situation, I mean, this, I think Elna presented this in the context of, in the today's situation too, right? In terms of what, people like to be able to say that everybody can chip in and help and do this, do that. But when it comes to consumers, right, what would be the message to some of the consumers? Mario, because you've been looking at slow food movement and slow fish and etc. Can you maybe we'll start from you in terms of your perspective, and then I also wanted to ask Kate to also chime in on this question as well.
I think that's a very hard question to answer. Especially for me, I look at food consumption, of course. What I noticed myself meeting fishers, they are actually they're very happy to talk with me and to get people interested in what they're doing. And of course, it's not easy to access fishers, but that maybe as a tourist, you can go to the docks and kind of ask what people are up to, show some interest in what's going on, and just also be curious about, just ask them what's up. Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize that the issues that fishers face, these are structural issues, much related to globalizations and regulation settings and stuff like that. So if we are aware of what's going on and the effects of governance on small-scale fishers or on small-scale food producers, just become aware might be a first good step. And often, I think there's so many stories to be found online, like Fair Fish from Glenn and Tom. They have a website and explain what they do. It's a number of these cases have pretty clear websites, and you can just read what they're up to. And I don't know if this is really helping, but awareness would be a good.
Right. Yeah. No. That is one of the reasons actually why we are bringing small scale fisheries to the conversation to around the world like this, right? I mean, when you think about today is World Oceans Day and it's about ocean sustainability, but where do small scale fisheries, what role do they play in that, right? And it's not just about food, but it's also about many things that we talked about here, right? Including that kind of cultural identity and this kind of you talk about pleasure, for instance, right? So people do interact with our world in quite different way. But the more important conversation that we are now seeing, and I wanted to turn a little bit of that discussion to eventually after we hear a little bit from from Kate as well on that previous question about local consumption. I want to start thinking about when, and it's a little bit related to what you said earlier, Andrew, as well. Now we have a situation where we need to make decisions, and that might involve different planning and strategies as we move forward. And there is a lot of promise from the ocean when it comes to blue growth and blue economy, but at the same time, there's still those sustainability issues and the potential that small scale fisheries could be further marginalized when in that context. So we might want to turn some of that conversation there as well. So we go back to you, Kate, first, just some thought on that, and then maybe we move a little bit into what is the ocean, what do you think about the sustainable ocean development?
Okay, I think like Mariella said, it's of improving awareness, and it's probably awareness around consumption. So in the Australian situation, it's kind of particular in that fishers have come to have a public reputation that's sort of almost got stigma. And it's partly to do with the way the environmental movement has developed in Australia. Fishers are not seen as respected primary producers that much. They're seen as environmental rapers and pillagers often. I mean, we've interviewed people whose children hide the fact that their parents fish at school and that sort of thing. And there are rocks thrown, there are people spat at. It's quite, it's a strange thing to see. So some awareness, and sometimes the way I talk about that is about joining the dots. Of course, people want to have their environment well protected. Of course, recreational fishing is very popular in Australia and people want to do their recreational fishing. But about joining the dots between having sustainable food production and the food that people want to eat, because we know people do want to eat local fish. Like it's quite strong in our phone surveys. The percentages of people that, especially when they're visiting the coast on holiday, want to be able to eat local seafood. So joining the dots between environmental protection, recreational fishing, local food production. And also we found that a lot of people seem to assume they're eating local without checking carefully, and they're probably not eating local. So asking more about where their seafood is from and learning the stories. And as Mariella said, that stories can be really interesting. So it's not about hard work of finding out some technical details. It's stories, it's people's stories about how they live and how they live in the environment and what the environment can produce for in terms of food. So that's what I think that the public can do. Learn more, have more awareness in a connected sense about how food fits within their whole environmental and social landscape.
That's great. Sakita, you have an example from Fiji that you wanted to add to this?
No, I was just saying that I was just going to give an example that in Fiji, every year we have this 4SJ campaign, which is where we get there's a ban on the harvesting of groupers during the spawning period. It's a bit of a challenging time because the government's having to decide whether to move this or not. But regardless, we are sort of working with the public to try and encourage them that there are lots of other alternative local fish that they could be catching. They can be also buying a lot more from some of these local fishermen to be helping with their livelihoods, and so giving them alternatives to going back to some bad fishing practices where we target fishing grounds. And I just wanted to highlight, using this chance, that we've also developed a sustainable seafood cookbook. So we're also using this opportunity to highlight, species that are sustainable, that we could be fishing and eating, but also that this recipe book is also highlighting in particular the role that women play in fisheries and this wonderful seafood that women bring to our doorsteps. So there are wonderful creative ways that you can engage, like Kate's saying, with the public to try and change consumption patterns for the better.
Thank you. Okay, so public, basically they're connecting the dots, raising awareness, and also, learning a little bit more about what we can do, learn the stories of the fisher's life and everything. That's really grand. So thank you for that thought. Okay, so Now, I really wanted to get to a little bit broader conversation about the ocean governance, right? Especially as, you know, how do small-scale fisheries fit in that whole governance landscape when it comes to ocean sustainability? And especially, many countries are moving into blue growth and blue economy. They all want to have this sustainable ocean development, and there are, you know, strategies and plans for that governments are doing. Have you seen any, you know, if you're looking, are you looking into any of those situations, and are there any things that that we really need to be aware of at this time in terms of how some of those initiatives may affect the, you know, the opportunity for small-scale fisheries, their well-being, livelihoods, you know, how, you know, whether anyone is looking into that at all? This is an open question to any of the panelists.
Mariella, do you want to go first, or shall I go first? Okay, since I'm unmuted. I think I can see in the Australian context anyway, two sorts of things happening, which one could be more positive for small-scale fisheries and one is more difficult. And one is that with the move towards the blue economy and also to do with more integrated coastal zone management in Australia, that small-scale fishers and joining the dots of water quality governance and coastal development governance and fisheries management, things are being looked at together in more of a whole of government approach. And I think that that's a positive move for small-scale fisheries. But then also what we've got, particularly in Australia, is perhaps quite a neoliberal approach to fisheries management, especially a strong belief that quota management is the gold standard. And this is very difficult for lower value fisheries and multi-species fisheries. And that is going to be probably more difficult. Also the sense that, a sense in government fisheries management that fisheries have to be profitable to be good fisheries, and if they're not super profitable, that they're not. Then some of these fisheries where it's been more of a livelihood, and, you know, as Mariella's looking into, where people might have more of a degrowth perspective on how they're working, that those kinds of fisheries can get pushed out with that kind of fisheries management. So I see two sorts of things happening with governance in Australia.
Thank you, Kate. I saw a research presentation last year at a conference where they talked about marine spatial planning, which is currently done globally, and the research was shocking in that almost no plan that was established by any government included fisheries or small-scale fisheries as using marine spaces. So I think that for me that was quite shocking and quite like eye-opening. Like, this is happening, and we're marginalizing, or like we're making this group completely invisible. And it's quite easy to make people invisible if the numbers of fishers are dropping, and people are getting isolated and don't realize that their problems are systematic problems. So what I found in the slow fish conversation we had last time, which was in May in Genova, Italy, was that they rejected blue growth, and they decided to open a conversation about blue commons, so commoning for marine spaces. And I think that aligns, and they haven't aligned it, but I think it aligns well with degrowth, and some people are looking into blue degrowth at the moment, and I think I can kind of tag into that as well, where degrowth's aim is to get GDP away from the center of governance making and of policy making, and instead of looking at GDP and growth, we should put social justice as well as the environment at the center of any governance arrangement and policy that's being created. So yeah, I it's quite extreme maybe, but I find myself in those spaces where people are trying to push for that.
So, Andrew, as a governance scholar, I mean, how do you feel about that kind of proposition? Is it really something we should be considering? The degrowth, putting these other kind of principles and perspectives into the way we think about governance of fisheries and how to do that.
I mean, I think it will take a massive change on all societal levels, and I mean, we need to dream big, but I can't fathom how that could, how the world will reorient themselves to align with the degrowth movement. Maybe I'm just being a pessimistic person here, but I mean, certainly I think it's what's needed for what can help small-scale fisheries being recognized and as a main contributor to ocean sustainability, their own sustenance and maintenance and growth. But yeah, as a lot of the world runs on neoliberal paradigm and not even neoliberal, but on a capitalistic mode of operation. Yeah, I'm not sure if degrowth is the way to go, or the other option would be us recognizing that small-scale fishers and their entities are also very much commercial enterprises that essentially wants to grow their livelihoods and businesses, and a lot of them want to create wealth for themselves so that they can retire. And related to that is an issue of them. A lot of existing fishers don't want their children to go into fisheries. I think that speaks to sort of the outlook, but also I think that's an outcome of small-scale fisheries and coastal fisheries being part of the capitalistic dynamic. But we haven't fully come to terms with that. I think a lot of the way we look at small-scale fisheries are, something to be protected, something to be, promoted. But I think there needs to be a bit more engagement of small-scale fisheries in the sort of capitalistic mode, and how we can then promote them, support them better.
Right. That's good. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, basically, earlier last week, we always talk about, we talk about blue justice. You also mentioned this concept. And the point is really about, small-scale fisheries can be part of the blue economy. In fact, if we really believe in the concept of blue economy, the way it's written, we would see the very central role that small-scale fisheries can play to make it happen, to really achieve the goal. But I started to see now that a lot of the initiatives that are branded as blue economy and blue growth don't always, follow those kind of principles, right? So we're still far from achieving that kind of, the goal that we wanted to have. But by all means, we need to continue to ask those hard questions, and the debate, from people from different perspectives would definitely be, I think it's useful to help move things forward. So remember that at the very towards, in about 5 minutes or so, I'm going to ask everyone to do this kind of final round of your thought in terms of, what would be your final message? Thinking about what we need to do moving forward could be in a short and sort of like a medium, and also in long term. So remember that in 2022, that will be the International Year for Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. And we definitely need to prepare ourselves I mean, what we don't want to happen would be to, you know, to have a conversation about just situation again and the challenges. I would hope, right, that by the start of the 2022, we would have something to offer. We would have been able to, you know, get ourselves from the research community, from you know, people working on the ground, and everybody can think about what we need to do today in order to really see sustainable and viable small-scale fisheries in 2022, considering too that we are in this COVID situation. So just a couple of thoughts first on this COVID situation, because we have another comment, another question, right, from our audience here. Maybe we could start from, I think there's two-part question. So basically, small-scale fishers, I mean, this is Harry, right, saying that small-scale fishers lost their capital due to COVID-19 and transportation, logistic limited, middleman buyers can bring the fish and etc. So price drop. I think that's something that you observed and already made that observation, Sangeeta. So after the pandemic, right, they might not have enough to go fishing. Is there ways to get them started again? So maybe Sangeeta and also Seno, you have any thought on this? That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we have to start thinking about, because I know our government's already thinking about what kind of economic packages to put out there. So I think we need to make sure, first of all, we have the right economic packages. We need to make sure they really do target those that are the most vulnerable. So we need to think about things like creating economic relief packets, aid, even look at things whether we have to look at things like loan forgiveness for those that are in the fisheries sector. So I think a lot of the packages are being discussed, but I haven't seen very many that are specifically thinking about what is the impact of the small-scale fisheries sector and what would be that right intervention.
Okay. So again, you know, there are other priorities, there are many things, and these kind of, kind of fast responses and not thinking about long-term consequences are kind of affecting us a little bit. So,
and making sure not just the loudest people get the support, or or the big companies. Thinking of everyone along that supply chain and thinking about who are the ones that need it the most.
And most of the time, women are not affected most and are looked at a lot less than others. So, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I see that one as simple, however very much relevant to the development lens on which I hope my study and my research can answer in the coming year. In that, though these activities in the Solomon context are happening at the community level, ongoing challenges have been transportation and communication. And though in the past decades, a clear example of projects that have come about, however, have not achieved its goals, have been the setup of fishery centers, for instance. Fishery centers in that buildings have been erected at parts of the country at very remote locations. However, in the recent years, there hasn't been much work done on the supply chain, on the supply chain of which takes that fish from a particular community to a center, and to a provincial center, and then to the national center. So those have been challenging in the projects on which I see an area of which my research can answer to would be looking at policy. Should we have policy in which is integrated, or there is policy in which there is cohesion between the agriculture sector, the fisheries sector, that can allow for activities as such to be sustainable. And to touch on the stimulation packages, which Sangeeta would talk of in the example for Fiji. Yes, in the Solomon Islands, we had those packages out as adverts. However, it got to last Friday, the 5th of June, and they've given time for the rural base, of which 80% of our population lives, in that they can apply. But I see a challenge in that the sectors of which relief packages or stimulation packages have been put out for have been quite broad in that we have very limited data to I can see that from my scholar point of view, in that how would they assess these applications? I mean, you would have any fisherman on any of the 9 islands who would have submitted an application, but where would they categorize the need today or for next year or for the coming 2 years? So I see that as some of the immediate challenges in the Solomon context.
Thank you. And I just thought I'm going to flag another question here before we go to the final round. And I appreciate this question very much from Federico, simply because we seem to forget, right? Of course, this COVID situation it's unprecedented. We can say that, but at the same time, there are a lot of other disasters and shocks that many of these small-scale fisheries have experienced. For some reason or another, have we not learned anything, and any lessons that we can take from our experience, and trying to do a little bit of fast. I don't want us to jump too quickly, but at the same time, we need to do something now. So can we take lessons from the past? Okay, anybody likes to take this question?
Well, I guess Tropical Cyclone Winston really hit Fiji very badly, and I think the lessons to me is that actually out of all the sectors, the fisheries sector is probably quite poorly prepared. So you saw agriculture, infrastructure quickly going out, counting up what is the impact, and then quickly putting recovery in places. We don't really have those systems in place for fisheries. And I think we need to develop, this is part of my closing I was going to say, is build these resilient systems around our fisheries, and now think about all these different external disturbances we're going to have, climate change, economic shocks, pandemics. So we have to think about all of those things, and how do we create systems back home that are going to be more resilient to that. And I think we're still lagging behind. I think there's so much more work to do. So I'm really grateful for the question. And I think we need to be doing much more thinking about this together.
Thank you. Andrew, you were going to say something as well?
Yeah, just a quick experience from the Philippines, where when they were repeatedly hit by giant typhoons, and their coastal areas were ravaged, and a lot of livelihoods were uprooted and houses blown away, etc. What they were doing is as they were recognizing the importance of mangroves or other coastal ecosystems as a coastal buffer, that came hand in hand with the community-based conservation and management schemes to take care of their coastal areas and replant mangroves, etc. So I think those type of a crisis in the form of typhoons were able to accelerate the community-based management and the importance of community stewardship, etc. in the Philippines.
Yeah. For some reason or another, we just really have to go back and take lessons a lot more than what we have done in the past, I think. And with those lessons, of course, we then can be more prepared and then get to the point about resilience that Sanjita was mentioning. Okay, final round. Now, why don't we just do the same order of presentation? So we start from Kate, and then we go there. So any kind of final message, take home, or hope, or what you like people to commit to as we are getting ready for the future, please.
Okay, I think probably for fishers and communities, and in terms of governance and consumers and everything, I think if we have a very local focus and we think about integration of different aspects of life and how they relate. So tourism, so for the Australian example, local tourism, environmental protection, recreational fishing, marine protected areas, how they can all interact together, and how the different sectors can support each other and not just act in silos. I think that's probably key to having small-scale fisheries be more sustainable and viable into the future.
Thank you for that, Kate. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I think my final message is that it's everyone's job to be a little bit more critical about what they hear and the things that they promote. So if things like illegal fishing, IUU fishing, we all know it's bad. I mean, how can you argue against that? But it's like it could be like marine conservation. Of course, it's something that we need to work towards. But there are ways that it can be done better. Ways that illegal fishing can be prevented. That doesn't further marginalize vulnerable populations and small-scale fisheries in many cases. So I think it's everyone's job, the public to be aware of those, and academics or researchers to expose those inconsistencies, and also policymakers and government officers to heed those different messages and put that into policies and implementation.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to see another topic of webinar on IUU. That's exactly what you're talking about, Andrew. That'd be great. Thank you. Seno?
A final wrap up from the panel is a quote from a colleague of mine at the workshop I held last month was, the COVID-19 situation has given time for the world to breathe. That was a quote he said during one of our discussions. It's given, for some context, it's giving people, the government, all levels of governance, the time to slow down and take it. People have been very much on the speed of in the last 4 decades. In that projects, programs have come in, concepts have been taken from top down. In that, with a local base of more than 8% of the population, hasn't been given the time to really absorb that. And I hope from my study, and there's hope for small scale fisheries in the country, in that there will be much more attention on policy, on having integrated policy in the different actors, as Kate mentioned earlier, can be together in a policy framework on which they can share their roles to play in any ecosystem. In that I see the communities in having a future for small scale fisheries. Again, thank you.
Thank you so much, Senu. Sangeeta.
I think I might build a little bit on Kate's comments, because I really agree with her. I think we need to start. My message would be to let's try and bolster these local food networks, these local food supply chains. Let's invest in both those individual entrepreneurs in the fisheries sector, as well as foster some really positive, socially responsible partnerships with the private sector. And really, let's empower, really try and make a better effort in terms of empowering local communities, local management, empowering local fishers, traders, all those in the sector. And I think we just need to make sure we are gender and socially inclusive the whole time, and really just make sure that nobody's left out of the conversation on how to move forward post-COVID-19. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. So a lot of work, but we all kind of have those goalposts, which are great to have. Okay, Maria.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking that we can really, like Andrew was saying with the example of the Philippines, maybe because of COVID, there will be a rapid possibility for change. And you can already see Amsterdam adopted a donut economy model, which means that they decide that there's a limited resources, and it's small steps, but it's happening. And I think so a lot of fishers right now are engaging in direct sales, and maybe rather than waiting for the government to respond or to tell them what to do, maybe the government can learn from what they're doing and kind of support their needs and support support their new markets. That's what I
That's great. So I think this is really great, and you're quite right. There's a lot of innovation out there already. There are a lot of creativity that we can also take a look at, and then trying to think about it. There might be a need to think a bit, do a little bit of experiment, but with good information and with the support. We talked earlier about how consumers or general public can be part of the solution as well in supporting small-scale fisheries. So there's a lot more conversation across all actors at all levels that we're going to need to continue to have. But so far, it's been very encouraging to see that situations, even though it's not the best, but there have been some opportunities. There have been some positive examples that we're seeing in all those places you're talking about. So I think this is a very good way to start the Oceans Day, and with these really great panelists that we have here for this session. So in an hour from now, we're going to move the conversation to Asia, South and Southeast Asia, to really hear about the situation there. And if you think about similar, they just had the cyclone Amphan, for instance, including and on top of everything. So the situation is pretty dire. So perhaps since you are already awake, you might want to just stay up a little bit and enjoy the next panel. In the meantime, there will be during the intermissions, we're going to be playing songs and dance and some arts festival. And like I said earlier, Maria contributes little photo essays, so all of that is included during the intermission. So we're gonna end the program, the first session for today, this morning, and with the hope that some of you would stay with us and until time for you to go to bed, I suppose. But anyway, thank you so much, everybody, for your insightful stories and experience, and your thoughts and ideas on these. We would definitely want to continue with the conversation and keep the small-scale fisheries at the center of the discussion about ocean sustainability. Thank you, and again, happy World Oceans Day, everyone.